March 2022. The West launched what it called the nuclear option of financial warfare. Within 72 hours, Russia was cut from SWIFT, the banking system that moves $5 trillion every single day. The goal? Collapse the Russian economy. The result? Something no one anticipated. Because in trying to destroy Russia's financial lifeline, the West accidentally triggered the beginning of the end for the US dollar's 80-year reign as the world's reserve currency. And the fallout is just beginning. So, what actually happened when Russia was cut from SWIFT? Who truly paid the price? And why are economists now warning that this single decision may have accelerated America's loss of financial dominance by decades? More importantly, if the dollar loses its status as the world's reserve currency, what happens to your savings, your purchasing power, and the global economy as we know it? Did the West just weaponize the dollar against itself? To understand how we got here, we need to go back. For over 80 years, the US dollar has been the undisputed king of global finance. It all started in 1944 at Bretton Woods, when world leaders agreed to peg their currencies to the dollar. Even after Nixon ended the gold standard in 1971, the dollar remained supreme through one brilliant move: the petrodollar system. Here's how it worked. Saudi Arabia and OPEC nations agreed to sell oil exclusively in US dollars. Want to buy oil? You need dollars. This created constant global demand for American currency, allowing the US to print money without triggering runaway inflation. It was financial genius. The dollar became not just money, it became essential infrastructure. And the backbone of this system, SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. Created in 1973, SWIFT became the messaging system that allows banks worldwide to communicate and transfer money. Over 11,000 financial institutions in more than 200 countries rely on it. It processes tens of millions of messages daily. Control SWIFT, and you control the arteries of global finance. By 2020, nearly 60% of global foreign exchange reserves were held in dollars. International trade settlements, 88% involved dollars. The system seemed unshakable, but it had one critical vulnerability that no one wanted to acknowledge. It had been weaponized. The United States and its allies had already used SWIFT as a weapon before. Iran was partially cut off in 2012 and again in 2018. North Korea faced restrictions. Individual banks in various countries had been blacklisted. But these were smaller economies, nations without significant global leverage. Russia was different. Russia was a G20 economy, a nuclear superpower, and most critically, a commodity giant that the world depended on. February 24, 2022. Russian forces invade Ukraine. Within days, Western leaders faced a choice: military intervention or economic warfare. They chose the latter, and they went further than anyone expected. On February 26th, just 48 hours after the invasion, the European Union, United States, and their allies announced the unthinkable. Major Russian banks would be expelled from SWIFT. Simultaneously, they froze over $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves held in Western institutions. It was the financial equivalent of dropping an atomic bomb. The immediate effect was devastating. The ruble crashed 30% in a single day. Russians lined up at ATMs. Western economists predicted Russia's economy would collapse within months. JP Morgan forecasted a 35% GDP contraction. The Financial Times called it economic Armageddon for Russia. The consensus was clear. Russia would be brought to its knees, forced to withdraw from Ukraine, and Putin's regime might even collapse under domestic pressure. But here's what they didn't predict. Within 6 months, the ruble had not only recovered, it became one of the best-performing currencies of 2022. How? And more importantly, what was happening beneath the surface that would change everything? Before we dive deeper into this financial chess game that's reshaping the world order, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell. This is the kind of analysis that gets more relevant with each passing month, and we'll be tracking these developments as they unfold. Also, drop a comment below. Do you think the dollar will maintain its dominance, or are we witnessing the birth of a multipolar currency world? Let's discuss. The West's strategy relied on one assumption, that Russia would have no choice but to capitulate. After all, who can survive without SWIFT? Who can function when cut off from dollars? But this assumption revealed a catastrophic blind spot. Russia wasn't alone, and this wasn't their first rodeo with sanctions. After Crimea in 2014, Russia and China had already begun building alternative systems. China launched CIPS, the cross-border interbank payment system, in 2015. Russia created SPFS, their own financial messaging system. India developed its Unified Payments Interface. These weren't emergency measures in 2022. They were insurance policies that were about to pay out. Think about what Russia and China learned from 2014. When the West imposed sanctions over Crimea, both nations realized they were vulnerable. They saw how the US could use the dollar-dominated financial system as a weapon. So, they started building backup systems, slowly, quietly. By 2022, these systems weren't perfect, but they were operational. And critically, they were interoperable. But the real game changer was energy. Russia is the world's largest exporter of natural gas and the second largest oil exporter. Europe needed Russian energy. Asia wanted it. And here's the crucial part. Russia demanded payment in rubles, yuan, or gold, anything but dollars. This was unprecedented. For decades, energy transactions happened in dollars. It was non-negotiable. But suddenly, if you wanted Russian gas, you played by Russian rules. And countries did. Because when winter is coming and your population needs heating, ideology takes a back seat to survival. China, facing its own tensions with the West, saw an opportunity. Trade between Russia and China exploded. In 2023, it exceeded $200 billion for the first time. But the currency? Not dollars. Yuan usage in Russia jumped from virtually nothing to over 95% of trade settlements between the two nations within a year. Let that sink in. Two major economies, representing over 1.5 billion people and trillions in GDP, completely bypassed the dollar in their bilateral trade. And it worked. Goods flowed, payments cleared, business continued. The dollar, it turned out, was optional. India started buying Russian oil at massive discounts, paying in rupees and dirhams. India's refined petroleum exports surged as they processed cheap Russian crude and sold it globally. Turkey maintained trade relationships, becoming a crucial link between Russia and global markets. The UAE became a crucial financial intermediary, with trade between Russia and the UAE increasing over 60% in 2023 alone. Suddenly, major economies were demonstrating something profound. You could conduct massive international trade without the dollar. The emperor had no clothes, but the real damage came from the freezing of Russia's central bank reserves. Think about this. If you're China, holding over $3 trillion in foreign reserves with a significant portion in US dollars and treasury bonds. What did you just learn? That in a geopolitical conflict, those reserves aren't yours. They're hostages. This sent shockwaves through every finance ministry on Earth. Finance ministers from Beijing to Brasilia, from New Delhi to Jakarta, all asked themselves the same question. Could this happen to us? And the answer, uncomfortably, was yes. If geopolitical winds shifted, if tensions escalated, their reserves could be frozen tomorrow. Trillions in national wealth could become inaccessible with the stroke of a pen in Washington or Brussels. In 2022, central banks purchased over 1,000 tons of gold, the highest level in 55 years. China, Russia, India, Turkey, and others were diversifying away from dollars at unprecedented speed. Poland increased its gold reserves by 150 tons. Singapore bought 26 tons. Even Uzbekistan and Iraq were stacking gold. The message was clear. Dollar reserves are political weapons that can be confiscated at will. The People's Bank of China, which had been slowly reducing its treasury holdings for years, accelerated the process. Official reserves showed decreases, but experts believe China is also moving holdings to Belgian and Swiss custodians to obscure the true extent of dollar divestment. The trust that once made dollar reserves attractive, that they were safe, liquid, and neutral, was shattered. But sanctions don't just affect governments. They devastate ordinary people. In Russia, middle-class families watched their savings evaporate overnight. International payments became impossible. Russians working abroad couldn't send money home. Students studying overseas were cut off. Visa and MasterCard stopped working. Apple Pay, Google Pay, gone. A Moscow software developer couldn't pay for cloud services. A pensioner couldn't receive money from her children working in Europe. The human cost of financial warfare is always highest among those least responsible for the policies that triggered it. In Europe, the blowback was severe. Energy prices quadrupled. German factories shut down for the first time since World War II due to gas shortages. BASF, one of the world's largest chemical companies, announced it might have to leave Germany permanently due to energy costs. British households faced the choice between heating and eating. Inflation across the EU hit levels not seen in 40 years, 10% in the Eurozone, forcing millions into poverty. In the UK, food bank usage reached record highs. In Germany, people reverted to using wood stoves. In France, the government imposed energy rationing on businesses. These weren't developing nations struggling with poverty. These were advanced economies where citizens suddenly couldn't afford basic necessities. And the ripple effects hit hardest in the developing world. Russia and Ukraine together account for nearly 30% of global wheat exports. Sanctions disrupted supply chains. Food prices spiked 60% in some African nations. Sri Lanka collapsed into bankruptcy, experiencing its worst economic crisis since independence. Pakistan teetered on the edge. Lebanon's financial system imploded. Egypt, heavily dependent on Russian and Ukrainian wheat, faced bread riots. The nuclear option created radioactive fallout that spread far beyond Russia. And many of these nations, watching this unfold, drew a conclusion. The Western-dominated financial system is not neutral. It's a tool of geopolitics, and if you depend on it, you're vulnerable. If you're finding this analysis valuable and want to understand how these global financial shifts could affect your own economic future, hit that like button and share this video. These aren't abstract geopolitical games. They have real implications for inflation, your investments, and the global economy you live in. And stick around because we're about to reveal who the real winners of this crisis are. And the answer might surprise you. What emerged from this crisis wasn't a unified world punishing Russia. It was a fractured global order, splitting into competing blocs. And here's what should terrify Western policymakers. The non-Western bloc is bigger. The West, US, EU, Japan, Australia, Canada, represents roughly 14% of the world's population and about 40% of global GDP. BRICS nations, over 40% of world population, 32% of global GDP, and growing fast. When you add BRICS partners like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Iran, you're looking at the majority of humanity and the majority of global commodity production. And these numbers are moving in one direction. Western GDP as a share of global GDP has been declining for decades and will continue to decline. By 2030, estimates suggest the West could represent just 30% of global GDP. The economic center of gravity is shifting east and south. The sanctions on Russia accelerated this trend rather than reversing it. The real earthquake came in March 2023. Saudi Arabia, the cornerstone of the petrodollar system since 1974, announced it was open to selling oil in currencies other than dollars. China and Saudi Arabia discussed yuan-denominated oil sales. For context, this would have been unthinkable even 5 years earlier. The US-Saudi relationship, forged in 1945 when FDR met King Abdulaziz, had one core pillar: oil for dollars. That pillar was now cracking. Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was strategic about this. He leveraged the opening to negotiate technology transfers, Chinese investment in Saudi infrastructure, and support for Vision 2030. China offered what the US increasingly couldn't or wouldn't: non-conditional partnership. No lectures about human rights, no regime change pressures, just business. At the 2023 BRICS summit in Johannesburg, the bloc expanded for the first time in over a decade, inviting 6 new members: Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. The message: there's an alternative to Western-dominated financial systems. Discussion of a BRICS common currency intensified. Even if that doesn't materialize soon, the intent is clear: reduce dollar dependency. The new development bank, created by BRICS in 2014 as an alternative to the World Bank and IMF, announced it would issue bonds denominated in members' local currencies. Loans would be extended in yuan, rupees, and reals, not dollars. For developing nations tired of IMF structural adjustment programs and dollar-denominated debt, this represented a genuine alternative. China's Belt and Road Initiative now spans 150 countries. Loans and investments, increasingly in yuan. Infrastructure payments, yuan. Trade, yuan. China isn't just building roads and ports, it's building a yuan zone that could encompass 60% of the world's population. And unlike the dollar system, which requires holding treasury bonds, the yuan system is backed by tangible infrastructure and trade relationships. A port in Pakistan, a railway in Kenya, a power plant in Indonesia. These create real economic dependencies that don't rely on faith in a currency or a government's promises. They're physical assets that facilitate trade. Here's where it gets dangerous for America. US national debt recently surpassed $34 trillion. The government funds itself by selling treasury bonds, with foreign buyers holding about $7.6 trillion of that debt. But those foreign buyers, they're selling. China has reduced its treasury holdings from over $1.3 trillion in 2013 to under $800 billion today. Japan, traditionally the largest foreign holder, is selling to defend the yen as it weakens. Belgium, often suspected of holding Chinese reserves in custody, has reduced holdings significantly. As dollar reserve status erodes, demand for treasuries falls. That means the US government has to offer higher interest rates to attract buyers. Higher interest rates on $34 trillion in debt? That's trillions added to annual deficits just in interest payments. In 2023 alone, interest payments on US debt exceeded $1 trillion for the first time, more than the defense budget. It creates a death spiral. More borrowing requires more bonds, requiring higher rates, requiring more borrowing. And there's another problem. For decades, America could print money without severe inflation because global dollar demand absorbed the excess. When the Fed expanded its balance sheet, those dollars flowed overseas to satisfy international trade needs. But if dollar demand craters, that money creation stays domestic, triggering the inflation we've already begun to see. The 2021 to 2023 inflation wasn't just pandemic stimulus, it was a preview of what happens when dollar privilege weakens. The Fed printed over $5 trillion during COVID. Normally, much of that would flow offshore, but with dollar usage declining in international trade, more stayed domestic. Result: the highest inflation in 40 years. Groceries up 25%. Housing costs surging. Real wages declining. This is what happens when exorbitant privilege starts to fade. So who wins when the dollar weakens? First, commodity producers. Countries rich in oil, gas, minerals, rare earths. They can demand payment in stronger currencies or gold. Russia, despite sanctions, had record oil revenues in 2022. Their energy earnings actually increased because they redirected supply to willing buyers and benefited from high prices. Saudi Arabia leverages its position for technology transfers and diversification. China wins strategically. Every country that adopts yuan for trade reduces American leverage. Chinese tech companies fill the void left by Western sanctions in Russia, cementing relationships. Huawei replaces Apple. WeChat replaces WhatsApp. Chinese payment systems replace Visa. The digital yuan provides China a blueprint for monetary surveillance that dozens of countries are now studying. And here's something crucial. China is positioning the yuan not as a reserve currency to compete directly with the dollar, but as a trade settlement currency. You don't need to hold massive yuan reserves, just enough to settle trades with China. This is a smarter, more sustainable strategy than trying to replicate dollar dominance. And quietly, financial intermediaries like the UAE, Singapore, and even Switzerland profit enormously. They become the neutral bridges between sanctioned nations and global markets, taking fees from every transaction that bypasses Western systems. Dubai's gold trade exploded. Singapore positioned itself as a yuan trading hub. Swiss banks, as always, maintained profitable neutrality. Make no mistake, losing reserve currency status would fundamentally alter American life. The US has enjoyed decades of exorbitant privilege, being able to run massive trade deficits because the world needs dollars. That privilege subsidizes American consumption by an estimated $800 billion annually. Think about what this means. Americans consume far more than they produce. The trade deficit runs about $1 trillion annually. This is sustainable only because other countries accept dollars for their goods, then hold those dollars as reserves or buy treasuries. It's an extraordinary arrangement that lets America live beyond its means without consequence. Without it, import costs surge. gas prices, consumer electronics, clothing, everything America imports becomes significantly more expensive. The standard of living that Americans take for granted relies heavily on the dollar's global role. Economists estimate that losing reserve status could reduce American purchasing power by 20 to 30%. Imagine your grocery bill increasing by a quarter. Your gas costs up 30%. That iPhone, now $1,500 instead of $1,000. This isn't abstract economic theory. This is your daily life getting significantly more expensive. And it's not because of inflation you can fight with interest rates. It's structural decline in currency value. There's also a national security dimension. The US maintains 750 military bases in 80 countries. That global presence is funded by dollar privilege. Printing money the world accepts. The defense budget exceeds $800 billion, but the real cost of global presence is over $1 trillion when you include veterans' care, intelligence, and related spending. Without dollar privilege, defense spending faces hard fiscal choices for the first time in generations. Domestically, rapid currency decline historically triggers political instability. When people's savings lose value and their purchasing power craters, they demand answers. Populism surges. Institutions lose credibility. The social fabric tears. We've seen this pattern in Argentina, Turkey, Venezuela, and countless other nations that experience currency crises. America won't be immune to these social dynamics. Globally, a disorderly dollar decline could trigger the fragmentation of international trade into regional blocs with different reserve currencies. That's a less efficient, more unstable world economy. Higher costs, slower growth, more potential for conflict. The post-World War II order, whatever its flaws, created unprecedented global prosperity. Its collapse could reverse decades of progress. We're approaching the conclusion of this analysis, but the conversation shouldn't end here. If you found this breakdown valuable, subscribe so you don't miss our upcoming videos on how to position yourself financially in a multipolar currency world and which investments might thrive as these tectonic shifts continue. Drop a comment with your biggest takeaway from this video, and let's keep this discussion going. So what happens next? There are three possible paths. Best case scenario, the US adapts. It reduces deficits dramatically, restores fiscal discipline, and negotiates a multipolar reserve currency system where the dollar remains important but shares status with the yuan, euro, and possibly a new BRICS mechanism. Think managed decline rather than collapse. This requires political will America hasn't shown in decades. It means cutting spending, raising taxes, and making hard choices about entitlements and defense. It means genuine diplomacy and compromise with rising powers. It's possible, but given the current political dysfunction, not probable. Middle case, the most likely, is gradual erosion. Dollar share of reserves drops from 60% to 40% over the next decade. The US experiences persistent inflation and slower growth, but no collapse. Global trade operates in multiple currencies. It's messy, inefficient, but manageable. Americans grow poorer relative to the past, but slowly enough to avoid revolution. This is the path of least resistance. No dramatic crisis, just steady decline. Living standards plateau, then slowly fall. The next generation inherits a poorer, more constrained America. It's depressing but survivable. Worst case, rapid disorderly dollar crisis. A major creditor, like Japan or China, dumps treasuries suddenly. Interest rates spike. The US can't finance deficits. Money printing accelerates, triggering hyperinflation. International trade freezes as no one trusts dollar value. Global depression follows, potentially with military conflicts over resources and trade routes. This scenario, while unlikely, can't be dismissed. Currency crises can be swift and brutal. Argentina went from prosperity to collapse in months during their 2001 crisis. Turkey's lira lost 80% of its value in just a few years. These things happen. And when they happen to a reserve currency, the global impact is catastrophic. Avoiding the worst requires painful choices Washington has been unwilling to make: genuine fiscal reform, reducing military commitments abroad, investing in productive domestic infrastructure, and, crucially, restraint in weaponizing the dollar. Every sanction makes alternative systems more attractive. But here's the paradox. The US can't stop using sanctions because they're one of the few policy tools that works without military intervention. But every use erodes the dollar's status. It's a trap. Using the weapon destroys the weapon. The more you sanction, the faster alternatives emerge. History teaches that empires rarely see their decline until it's too late. Rome debased its currency. Britain watched the pound lose reserve status after World War II. The pattern is always the same: overextension, excessive debt, and the weaponization of economic power accelerates loss of trust. Britain's experience is instructive. The pound was the world's reserve currency for over a century. After WWI, Britain was heavily indebted. WTBars pushed it over the edge. By 1944, everyone knew the dollar would replace the pound. But the formal end came gradually. The pound remained in reserves into the 1970s. But Britain's relative decline was swift. Loss of reserve status meant loss of global influence, loss of living standards, and decades of adjustment. The cutting of Russia from SWIFT was supposed to demonstrate Western power. Instead, it may have revealed Western vulnerability. It showed the world that the dollar system isn't neutral infrastructure. It's a political weapon. And when you turn infrastructure into a weapon, people build alternatives. We're now in a race. Can the US reform before crisis forces catastrophic change? Can international agreements create a stable, multipolar currency system? Or will we stumble into financial chaos through miscalculation and denial? The dollar won't disappear tomorrow. Reserve currency transitions take decades. But make no mistake, the process has begun. The world is already preparing for a post-dollar dominance reality. The only question is whether America is prepared for what comes next. Because in trying to weaponize the world's reserve currency, we may have just destroyed it. The 80-year reign is ending. What happens in Act 2?